Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your host, the Mighty Bjorn, and today for you on my YouTube channel, I have the 44th episode of Community Steel. And we're going to kick off today's episode with the Object 780 Modern by Sensi 0806. And yeah, this thing's pretty cool, actually. It definitely has the Soviet influence of like the T-72B3. It is upscaled a little bit to be more of like a heavy tank, so kind of think of it like when I was messing around with this, I was kind of thinking along the lines of like a modernized T10 or something along those lines, or like a modern IS-3. Now that being said, it weighs in at 49.8 tons, so it is on the heavier range of tanks, although not really for today's standards, but would have been back in like World War II era. It has a 130 millimeter main gun with 208 millimeters of penetration, and it actually does have a coaxial 20 millimeter cannon with 53 millimeters of penetration. It is for the late war period. Sensi does have the muzzle brake actually modeled on here, so that's kind of cool. The armor is really effective, especially because of its shaping. I'm not so sure about thickness, although thickness-wise, I do want to assume that this is a thicker tank because it does look more like an actual heavy tank. Now, the one thing I found interesting is the tank has a cope cage. I don't know why it's positioned at the rear of the turret. I mean, I know that's where the ammunition is stowed, but basically what you're saying with the cope cage is yeah, the ammo is more important than the crew. But okay, fine. It does have ERA type looking armor, so there's that. And all in all, I actually found the vehicle to be quite effective. Mobility wise, it's not bad. It's got, you know, pretty mediocre turn radius, but other than that, it drives around pretty good. It's, you know, pretty effective vehicle actually. It would be really incredibly effective, I believe, even against some of the more modernized tanks that some of the people have created in Sprocket that I've actually featured in the past. Even though in general terms I'm going up against Hellcats and King Tigers. And here I'm actually using the 20 millimeter gun, and I killed a Hellcat with it. So there you go. The next vehicle I have is the FT-20B from Artsy Johnny. This weighs in at 14.74 tons. It's armed with a 75 millimeter main gun, 65 millimeters of penetration, and it is for the interwar period. This is supposed to be more of an infantry support tank, if I recall correctly, going by what Artsy Johnny said, but it's actually rather quite mobile for an infantry support tank, let alone an interwar period tank. This thing actually drives really well for its period. Probably better than it should, realistically. And the gunnery system is actually rather good, and so is the armor. He used a lot of angle plate. Basically, everything is angled, including the turret, so it made the armor very effective. And as you can see here, I am bouncing a lot of shots from different directions. And all in all, I think the design is actually rather cool. I like how the rear is designed where the track is actually partially exposed. It kind of gives it that older feel to it, especially because he used the slotted track skirts with the mud chutes. So yeah, I mean, that's something that would kind of go away over the years. And actually, weaknesses wise, I didn't really see many weaknesses, if any, because it's just a solid tank. The only thing that's probably kind of bad on it, and still it's rather good for the interwar period, is the turret traverse. But, I mean, yeah, it's still actually pretty good for interwar period turret traverse. The next vehicle I have here is the RT-57U from VVX2. And this weighs in at 16.72 tons. It is armed with a 90 millimeter main gun, and it has 200 millimeters of penetration. It is for the late war period. It is actually an asymmetric design. The gun is actually off to the right of the turret. And the overall design of the vehicle kind of gives me the opinion that this would actually have an autoloader. And when it comes to speed, this thing is very mobile. You know, I've compared other vehicles like this before, but yeah, it drives like a sports car. And the gun is actually rather good on it. I am kind of having some issues here with these vehicles because they're very lightly armored. And the vehicle is only loaded with armor piercing. I would change the loadout if it was me to have a little bit of armor piercing high explosive for moments like this, because the armor piercing high explosive would actually be way more effective, and I'd be one-shotting these vehicles for sure with that 90mm main gun. The reload speed is actually rather good as well. About the only downfall with this vehicle is actually the armor. The armor's not very good. Now, it's shapely, so it does make it fairly effective, but I mean, against actually real legit heavier anti-tank guns, the armor on this thing is not very good at all. But that being said, I think it was designed in mind to be a more modernized light tank, because that's what it drives like, that's what it feels like, and I'm pretty sure that's pretty much what it is. You know, this is something that if it was a real tank, it probably would have competed with, say, some of the more modern light tanks like the M8 or even like the AMX 1390. Something along those lines. The next vehicle I have here is from Coconut Cooler, and this is his Ferdinand. And I have to give him credit for this. This actually feels like the Ferdinand. It drives like a lumbering behemoth. Its turn radius is absolutely trash. However, the gun is actually rather good, very effective, very accurate gun. And I actually give him credit. He actually did take time to model an accurate gun mantlet for this Ferdinand. It's actually the first Ferdinand I've seen with an accurate, or at least a fairly accurate depicted gun mantlet. The armor is actually quite effective, but that being said, I think it's 200 millimeters, and then it's got a slight slope to it, so it is quite thick armored for its time period. This is for the late war period, but probably should be leaning more towards the mid-war. I'm not too sure. And all in all, that being said, like I said, the gun's very effective. It's even effective against some of the heavier tanks. I actually had to go up against my own Tiger tanks here, and I actually I went against KV2s, but I also, during testing, I did go up against some Tiger tanks, and this Ferdinand was really effective against those Tiger tanks. As you can see here, I'm just like ruling these KV2s with very little problem. The reload speed is also rather good, so I'll give them credit there for that. And like I said, all in all, it feels like I was playing a Ferdinand. It's kind of lumbering, even though it's got a good speed going straight. The turn radius is pretty trash. And all in all, I never really reached top speed with this. I don't know what the top speed really is, because the acceleration's kind of meh. But yeah, you know, it works. It is what it is. The next vehicle I have here is the VSLF-1 from Nathan the Dummy. This is an interwar tank weighing in at 10.9 tons, armed with a 47mm main gun. And it's got 65 millimeters of penetration, and I actually rather like this vehicle. I like the look of it. I like the feel of it. It's got a good feel. Its mobility is not absolutely horrendous. I also like how he modeled the air cleaner system. It's got an exterior air cleaner system. That's why you see that conduit pipeline, if you will, going out of the engine deck to the rear to that box. That would be the air filter system, which I believe that's something he stole from the Covenanter. I think it's the Covenanter had an exterior fuel tank, or not fuel tank, air cleaner system. But yeah, it looks good. It's got a spotlight on the roof. The armor actually isn't bad. It's pretty effective armor-wise, especially for its time period. Now, in later time periods, the armor wouldn't do as well, but it's not bad. It's got a good general overall design, in my opinion. And of the tanks that I've received from Nathan the Dummy so far, and understand that I have featured some of his tanks in the past, this is actually probably one of his better ones, if not his best one, that he's ever sent me. So definitely a very cool vehicle. I really like this one. And the final tank is the HGS 105-4 from Gunter. This weighs in at 66.17 tons, armed with a 130 millimeter main gun with 220 millimeters of penetration. And this is for the late war period. And what I have to say about this is what happens when you take the Shagohod from Metal Gear Solid 3 and breed it with an Object 279, because that's what this looks like to me. It looks like a combination of those two things. You know what? I wish I would have got an image of an Object 279. Now, one thing I think is really unique, although I think could have used a bit of custom decaling, was instead of actual tracks, he covered the tracks up to make it look like it would be powered by screws. This was actually a legit thing the Russians did try to do. And that's actually the other thing I admire about this vehicle is it does have a Russian look, Russian feel to it, especially because of the turret. It's got very thick armor. The mobility is actually rather awesome. Now, one area that I feel is a downfall of this vehicle, although it does have a very large caliber gun, is the reload speed itself is kind of slow. But I mean, when you're as well armored as this thing is, or is this as well armored as this thing seems to be, that just does not matter. It really doesn't, because the armor can take the abuse while you're reloading if you need to reload. Very good overall design. I just kind of rolled through and bossed up on everything. The mobility is actually way better than probably it should be, especially for its weight, because it's actually a pretty heavy vehicle for how well it turns, how well it maneuvers. I just don't know how he did it. I mean, it's kind of some kind of weird Russian space magic, I guess. Kind of like Kraut space magic, just not as awesome. Anyway, folks, that's going to wrap up today's episode of Community Steel. Share these with your friends. Hopefully you've been enjoying them. Thank you very much for tuning in, and have yourself a wonderful day.